Having talked about various kinds or categories of rights, I would now like to move on to talk about various protection systems. This will firstly cover the United Nations and then in the sessions and weeks that follow, various regional systems. I will start with the United Nations, and in this first video I want to cover some general aspects and give a general introduction, before then in the second clip talking about reporting procedures, and then in the third one more specifically about the individual complaints mechanisms. Given the structure but also the limited length of these clips, I will not be going into the very technical details of how the UN system is organized, and obviously the textbook does a great job in providing these detailed aspects and explanations. Rather, what I want to do here is to remain focused on the practical challenges and the practical usefulness of the United Nations system, with the goal being to provide you a good understanding of the role that the United Nations overall plays in the field of human rights. The first thing to mention is perhaps that we should not forget that the United Nations are a very large organizations with a lot of different departments, funds, programs, and so on and so forth. And obviously many of them are related to human rights. Think, for example, about UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, which obviously makes a big contribution to realizing the rights of children worldwide. Or think more specifically as well about the World Health Organization, as we are living through a global pandemic that has impacted our rights in various forms for over a year now. All these agencies have to work on human rights, have to streamline human rights into their policies, into their programs. So the narrow focus on United Nations human rights mechanisms specifically does sometimes lose sight of this larger picture. That said, the United Nations obviously also focuses on human rights realization specifically. And this is not surprising if you look, for example, at Article 1 of the UN Charter of 1945, which mentions as one of the organization's goals the promotion and encouragement of respect of human rights. But also if you look at the 1993 World Conference in Vienna on human rights, where again human rights was put center stage at the very core of the organization's mandate and overall objectives. Given that human rights are part and parcel of the organization's overarching objective, it is not surprising that since the beginning there have been human rights bodies or branches within the organization, and it was of course the Human Rights Commission led by Eleanor Roosevelt, which eventually put together the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And even after that, it remained active for another 60 years, setting standards, creating institutional capacity within the United Nations to also implement and also monitor human rights. And eventually it got replaced by the Human Rights Council, which, although one can really look at the various differences, plays a very similar role at the end of the day as a human rights body that is basically composed of state parties and their delegates, and that is involved in the promotion of human rights and in the resolution of particular human rights crises. Obviously, I will be addressing aspects such as Universal Periodic Review, the special procedures, as well as the complaint mechanisms in the next two videos. Next to the charter-based bodies, we then have, of course, the treaties and everything that emerges from the treaties. There's the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which, as you know, is not a treaty, complemented by the 9 binding treaties that they are, protecting either particular sets of rights or particular groups. And all of those also have attached to them a specific committee that is in charge of monitoring and possibly also receiving individual complaints on aspects, on cases that relate to the specific rights in question. These committees are expert bodies, so they usually consist of academics, diplomats, lawyers, perhaps former judges, usually 10 to 25 members in each of these committees, who then meet usually twice a year to tackle the various tasks that emerge from their pro bono work. Another very important function that I will not be specifically mentioning in the next videos, but that you have actually already encountered, is that these committees in particular are very important for law formation. They actually provide general comments on various rights, on various articles. They are extremely important for us to understand what specific provisions entail in an instrument. Now, this may be an obvious aspect, but you should obviously keep in mind that the states may or may not have ratified a particular human rights instrument, which means that the provisions are either applicable or not, if there's not been a ratification, and also that the committee, in only the cases in which a state party has ratified the treaty, will actually have jurisdiction, or in any case, the ability to review reports or review human rights practices. This obviously complicates matters further because depending on a specific status of a ratification, a human rights treaty body may be included in the whole process or it may not be. Before moving on to cover specifically reporting and then complaints mechanisms, a few words on the role of NGOs. And this was, of course, the third reading question that you had for today. NGOs are, of course, extremely important as both the drivers and the guardians of this system. In the reporting procedures, they provide for shadow reports to the human rights treaty bodies. They're involved in consultation processes. They're also involved in universal periodic review, where they provide so-called stakeholder information. However, they can also possibly be the ones filing complaints, or at least assisting the filing of complaints. And obviously, they're also there to raise awareness of particular rights abuses, to put them on the agenda, for example, of the UN Human Rights Council and their special procedures. And they're, of course, vital for scrutinizing and critiquing the functionality of the UN system, particularly the charter-based systems, the Human Rights Council, which is often perceived as political or sluggish in the way it goes about its business. To that end, many NGOs, and especially the larger ones such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have obtained observer status before the Human Rights Council, which gives them a sort of permanent ongoing stake in the whole process that underlines this particular human rights promotion at the UN level. This concludes the first clip. I'll now move on to talk about reporting under the UN system more specifically.